Rosai Gutavach, it's an incredible schus to be able to begin the week learning the daf with all of you. Today's daf is daf Chavches. Shabbos is daf Chavches. We are picking up on Chav Zayin Amud Beis 27b, exactly 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 12 to 13 lines up from the bottom. So also remember again, we're focusing now on the position of Rabbi Yehuda, where the Gemara said the Mishnah quoted Rabbi Yehuda holds ein bir chametz ela b'sreifa. The only way to dispose of chametz, ultimately again, is through burning it. So says the Gemara. So remember, the Gemara is trying to figure out where exactly does Rabbi Yehuda learn this concept from. So Chazar Rabbi Yehuda v'dano dinacher. So in yesterday's daf we saw Rabbi Yehuda made one attempt. Rabbi Yehuda makes now a second attempt. No sar aser b'achila v'chametz aser b'achila. No sar, leftover sacrificial matter, is aser b'achila. And chametz is aser ba'achila. Ma noser b'sreifa, av chametz b'sreifa. Just like noser is disposed of with sreifa, so too chametz is disposed of with sreifa. Amru lo nevela tochiach. They said to Rabbi Yehuda, the Rabbanan said to Rabbi Yehuda, what about nevela? What about the carcass of an unshechted animal? Sha'asura ba'achila ve'in latun esreifa. On nevela, you're not permitted to eat it. It's an isra achila, but yet you don't have to dispose of it through sreifa. Amru lohen hefresh. So Rabbi Yehuda says there's a distinction between the cases. What's the distinction? No sar asar ba'achila uba'ana. No sar is asar both by achila and hana. The chametz asar ba'achila ba'ana. Chametz is also asar ba'achila ba'ana. So, but again, remember, nevela is not. Nevela can't be eaten. But nevela, ultimately, you can get benefit from it. So therefore, again, the comparison between chametz and nosar is stronger than a comparison between chametz and nevela. Ma nosar ta'un sreifa, av chametz ta'un sreifa. Therefore, just as nosar must be burned when you dispose of it, so too chametz must be burned when you dispose of it. So the Rabbanan again said back to Rabbi Yehuda, Amrulo, shar haniskal yochiach. What about a shar haniskal? Remember again, shar haniskal is an ox that killed someone, and as a result, the ox itself is killed. So about shar haniskal, sha'asr b'achila ba'ana ve'in ta'un sreifa. Shar haniskal is a good example. You're not allowed to eat it. You're not allowed to get benefit from it. But yet, halacha l'maisa, there's no din sreifa. There's no din of burning it. Amr lahen hefresh. Rabbi Yehuda says, I'll tell you the difference. Why it's not a good comparison to shar haniskal. No sir asr ba'achila ba'ana v'anoshkaris. The chametz asr ba'achila ba'ana v'anoshkaris. So remember again, there's a much stronger connection between chametz and nosar than chametz and shar haniskal. Why? Because chametz, like nosar, have an isra achila, an isra hana'ah, and if you consume it, there is a chiyuv kares. Remember again, that same punishment does not apply to the consumption of a shar haniskal. So therefore, again, we could say the comparison works. Ma nosar v'sreifa, af chametz b'sreifa. Therefore, just like nosar is disposed of with sreifa, so too chametz will be disposed of with sreifa. Amrulo. So the Rabbanan said back to Rabbi Yehuda, chelbo shashar haniskal yochiach. Let's compare chametz to the case of chaylev of a shor haniskal. Why? Sha'asr ba'achila ba'ana va'anoshkaris. Because remember again, chaylev of a shor haniskal satisfies all three criteria. You're not allowed to eat it, you're not allowed to get benefit from it, and if you consume it, there's a chiyuv kares. Ve'ein ta'on sreifa. But yet, interestingly enough, there is no din of burning it. So I'll say, you see from here, just because something is asar ba'achila and asar ba'ana and carries a chiyuv kares, does not automatically add up to the logical conclusion that the only way to dispose of it is through sreifa. Top of Chav Zayin. Rabbi Yehuda v'danu din acher. Therefore, Rabbi Yehuda comes along and he gives another explanation. He says, no sar yeshna b'bal tosiru v'chametz b'bal tosiru. No sar and chametz share a common lav. What's the common lav? Not leaving something over. Remember again, what's nosar? Nosar is sacrificial matter left over past its prescribed time. What's chametz? Chametz is leaven, again, left over past its permitted time. So therefore, again, man nosar b'sreifa, chametz b'sreifa. Just like nosar ultimately again is dealt with sreifa, so too chametz is dealt with sreifa. So once again, the Rabbanan say, Amrlo, Asham taloi v'chata sa'ov haba safek lidvarecha yochichu. So the Rabbanan bring two other cases. They both say Asham taloi. So remember again, Asham taloi is brought in a situation where a person commits an avera whose intentional violation would bring a chiyuv kares. So Rashi gives the example, kegon chelev v'shuman lefanav. I have a piece of chelev, which is prohibited fat, with a piece of shuman, which is permitted fat. Both pieces are in front of me. I know that I ate a piece, I just don't know which piece I ate. So therefore, what does one do in such a situation like that? You bring an asham taloi. So imagine you bring an asham taloi, you're about to offer it up, or you offer it up, but then something invalid happens. They never got a chance to sprinkle the blood, or some other psul that invalidates the carbon, or for that matter again, chatas ha'ov haba ala safek. Or if you have a chatas, Rabbi says, this is talking about a woman who miscarried, and she's not sure whether or not what she miscarries satisfies the halachic definition of a birth, which would require karban yoledes. So she brings a chatas ha'of haba ala safek. Now that karban, Rashi points out, is not consumed. Rather, again, it's not consumed, it never goes on the Mizbeach. So the Gemara says, Sha'anu Orim B'Sreifa. So remember again, here's what's interesting. See, here are two cases. Asham Taloi and Chatas Ha'of, where the Rabbanon say that it has a din of Sreifa, you have to burn it. Va'ata Omer B'Kvura. And yet you, Rabbi Yehuda, hold, ultimately again, that you bury it. Now Rashi points out the question here is much more targeted towards Asham Taloi. Let's look at this for just a moment. So in Asham Taloi, so remember again, I go ahead, I ate a piece of meat, I don't know, is it chelev or is it shuman? Is it permitted or is it asr? So if I ate chelev, that would carry with it, if I did it intentionally, it would carry with it a chi of kares. So I bring in Asham Taloi. So I bring my karban, now something happens to invalidate the karban. So now what do I do with the leftover karban? So listen to this. Rabbi Yehuda's logic up until now was, if something is asr ba'achila, asr ba'ana, and if you consume it as a chi of kares, you should burn it. You should have to burn it to dispose of it. After all, that's what Rabbi Yehuda said by chametz. That's what he said by nosar. Yet, interestingly enough, the Rabbanan come along and say, by the way, Rabbi Yehuda, in the case of Asham Taloi, you're the one who says that if you can't offer it, you bury it. And yet we, the Rabbanan, are the ones who are saying that if you can't offer it, you burn it. So Rabbi Yehuda, we're poking a hole, we're blasting a hole in your argument. You're saying every single time something is asr ba'achila, asr ba'ana, and the chi of kares, you should have to burn the remnants of it. That's your raya, that the only way to destroy chametz is through beer. But yet you yourself, we give you a case over here of the Asham Taloi, and yet you say it's buried, not burned. Shasak Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda was silenced, and he realized that his argument was refuted. So listen to this. Amarav, Hainu Damri Inshi. Shavio said, this is what people say. There's a couple of expressions in Aramaic. Kafa dechata nagra begava nisrav chardala. So literally translated, the craftsman who made the bowl will burn his tongue in the mustard contained within. Obviously, it sounds much better in the Aramaic, but you understand, meaning the craftsman himself made the bowl, yet the irony of ironies is that sometimes the craftsman is harmed by the very thing he created. Ultimately, saying, Rabbi Yehuda, you espouse this whole argument, and yet the argument that you're trying to advance by chametz, ultimately, again, is refuted by another argument you made by Asham Taloi. Another expression, Amar Abaye, Sadna bisadani Yasiv, Midvil Yadei Mishtal. Abaye says people say that the shackle maker ends up getting trapped in his own shackles. Midvil Yadei Mishtal. He is rewarded from his own handiwork. So again, same expression. Sometimes that which you create in life ultimately later on, unfortunately, entraps you. Rava Amar Gira Begira Mikdal Midvil Yadei Mishtal. Sometimes the arrow maker is killed by his own arrows and ultimately again is repaid from his own handiwork. So all they're just pointing out is that this framework that Rabbi Yehuda espoused as the raya to say that chametz has to be burned, ultimately again we see that halacha l'maisa, it doesn't hold up in other circumstances. Again, we'll come back to this halacha in just a moment. The Gemara goes on. It happens to be there's actually like an incredible musr in these as well, that before a person takes action in life, whether it's what I say or what I do, person has to be so conscious that my words and my actions should never come back to bite me. In other words, if I do something and I would be later on confronted by this act, would I be comfortable admitting that I did this? Or if I said something and I was later on confronted with what I said, would I be comfortable acknowledging or taking ownership for that which I said? Because sometimes the craftsman is trapped by the very thing he created. Now, of course, with Rabbi Yehuda, they're just saying his teachings are contradicting each other. But what an incredible life musr. Never say anything you don't want to be confronted with. And never do something you don't want to be confronted with. Incredible. So the Gemara goes right to the Chum say, the Chum say you don't have to burn chametz. Rather, all you have to do is what? Crumple it up and throw it into the wind. So both say, listen to this. This is actually very interesting. So remember, the lashon of the Mishnah said as follows: that Rabbi Yehuda, the Chachamim said, "Af mefara rezor l'ruach o matiliyam." So the Chacham say you don't have to just dispose of chametz through burning it. Rather, you could crumble it up, zor l'ruach, throw it into the wind, o matiliyam, and throw it into the sea. So the Gemara asks the question: Ibai lehu. Heichi ka'amar. What are the Chacham saying? Mefarer v'zor l'ruach mefaru mataliyam. are the Chacham saying that either way, whether you're going to throw the chametz into the wind or you're going to throw the chametz into the sea, the first step is you have to crumble up the chametz. That's the first thing. You have to crumple up the chametz. O Dilma, mefar v'zor l'ruach avamat l'yam be'enei. Or maybe the only thing you have to crumple it up is when you're throwing the chametz into the wind. But if you're throwing the chametz into the sea, there's no obligation to go ahead and grind it up or crumple it up first. So that's the shaila. Tanan, so the Gemara says, we learned this Tanan and the Gabi Avodah Zarah. This same shaila comes up by Avodah Zarah. Ki agavna Rabbi Yossi Omer, shochek v'zor l'ruach umati l'yam. Rabbi Yossi says that halacha l'maisa, if you're destroying Avodah Zarah, how do you destroy Avodah Zarah? You grind it up and you throw it into the wind, or you could throw it into the sea. And we asked the same kasha by Avodah Zarah. Heichi kamar shochek v'zor l'ruach v'shochek umati l'yam. Is Rabbi Yossi saying that either way, when you dispose of Avodah Zarah, the first thing you have to do is grind it up? Is that the first thing you have to do is grind it up? And then you want to throw it into the wind, you want to throw it into the water. Is that what Rabbi Yossi is saying? Or maybe no, the obligation to grind up the Avodah Zarah is only if you're throwing it into the wind. But if you're throwing it into the water, there's no obligation to grind it up beforehand. So we'll say, interesting machlokes. Amar Rabba, mistabra Avodah Zarah deliyam hamelach ka'azla lo ba'ishchika. So we'll say, Rabba says that it would appear that halacha l'maisa, Avodah Zarah itself, the lashon, we just had this in today's daf, that, or it really was part of yesterday's daf, but we did it today. We did it Erev Shabbos, we did it Friday. So Rabbi says that the halacha by Avodah Zarah is whenever you want to dispose of Avodah Zarah, the lashon of the Gemara is yolich hanoah liyam hamelach. Throw the hanoah into the Red Sea, into the Dead Sea, I should say, Yam HaMelech, the Dead Sea. So we'll say, so what's the pshat? Because the assumption is the Dead Sea, there's no one travels on the Dead Sea. There's no boats going on the Dead Sea, the Gemara assumes. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, there's no concern that someone's going to come and pick up the Avodah Zarah and get benefit from it. So therefore, if you throw it into the Yam HaMelech, you don't have to do anything. You just have to dispose of it, and that's all. So the Gemara says, chametz to l'shar naros kazil, but chametz, which could be thrown into any body of water, by peirer, ultimately, again, requires grinding up beforehand. So we'll say the shita of Rava is that chametz Avodah Zarah only has to be ground up if you're throwing it into the wind, because then people might have access to it. You have to destroy it before you scatter it. But because Avodah Zarah is only disposed of in Yam HaMelech, you don't have to grind it up before you go out and dispose of it. Rather, you could just dispose of it. Comes along, however, chametz, which can be disposed of in any body of water, including bodies of water which have, we'll call it pedestrian traffic. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, chametz must always be ground up before it is discarded. So Rav Yosef comes along. Amalei Rav Yosef, Ad Rabba, Ipcha Mistabra. Rav Yosef says, Rabba, I think you're wrong. Just the opposite is true. How so? Avodah Zarah d'lo memisa b'yishchika. Avodah Zarah doesn't dissolve. Right? If you throw Avodah Zarah into the water, maybe it will dissolve over a large number of years, but it's not going to dissolve. And therefore, again, b'yishchika, no matter where you are disposing of Avodah Zarah, the goal is to destroy it. And as such, halacha l'maisa, you must go ahead and actively crumble it wherever you're throwing it. However, chametz demamis lo baiper. But chametz, you throw a loaf of bread, you throw chametz into the water, it's going to dissolve. So therefore, again, you don't have to go ahead and crumple the chametz. So we'll say, so fundamental machlokus between Rabbah and Rav Yosef. Again, Rabbah telling me that Avodah Zarah does not need to be crumbled before it is discarded, because I would just say differently. If it's going to be discarded in a body of water, it doesn't need prior crumbling. Why not? Because Avodah Zarah is only discarded in Yam HaMelech. If, of course, you're going to discard it into the wind, then it must be crumpled beforehand. Rav Yosef, just the opposite. Avodah Zarah always has to be crumpled, always has to be smashed beforehand. Whether you're throwing it into the wind or a body of water, for one simple reason, it won't dissolve on its own. But chametz, which will dissolve on its own, no need to crumple it before you throw it into a body of water. Of course, if you're going to throw it into the wind, you have to crumple it. So Tanya Kavase de Rabba, Tanya Kavase de Rav Yosef. Also, you have a brayso that supports both Rabba as well as Rav Yosef. So the Gemara says, what's the brayso? Here we go. Tanya Kavase de Rabba, brayso that supports Rabba. Haya mahalich b'midbar, mefarer v'zora l'ruach. If a person was walking in the desert and he has this chametz, what does he do? He crumples it up and he throws it into the wind. Haya mahalich b'svina. If you are walking on a boat, mefarer umatil liyam. So if you're walking on a boat, then what do you do? Or not walking on a boat, but if you're on a boat, then halacha l'mais, you must crumple it up and throw it into the water as well. So we'll say this is the sheet of Rabbah, that no matter how you're disposing of the chametz, you must always go ahead and crumple it up before discarding it. Tanya Kavasi de Rabbi Yosef, a brayso that supports Rabbi Yosef. Hayim mahalich b'midbar. If a person was walking in the desert, shochek v'zor l'ruach. A person crumples up the chametz and throws it into the wind. Hayim mahalich b'svina. But if a person was on a boat, shochek umatil liyam. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Shchika kashya l'Rabba, Peirer kashya l'Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef, each of these braisos that you quoted in order to align with the different shita, they each pose a question, right? In the braisa that was according to Rabba, Shchika, the grinding up ultimately poses a kasha, and ultimately again, Peirer kashya l'Rav Yosef. To which the Gemara says, Shchika l'Rabba lo kasha. No, the case of grinding up according to Rabba is not a question. Why not? Hali amamelach halushar naros. Both say the only time Rabba will say that halacha l'maisa, that it doesn't require shchika is going to be into Yamamelach. But in other bodies of water, it does require shchika. Peirur l'Rav Yosef lo kasha habechiti habenama. Similarly, again, I will say again, the spreading around according to Rav Yosef is also not a contradiction. One is referring to wheat, and one is referring to a loaf of bread. Rashi points out over here, what's the distinction? A loaf of bread apparently will dissolve in water, but stalks of wheat, Rashi says bechiti shechmitzu by peirur kolomar. Pizur shelo yitnem bisak v'yizur came el yifazim apanei hamayim shelo yuchlu adam lalaktam apanei hamayim. So apparently, interestingly enough, when it comes to chiti, so again, you're throwing a loaf of bread, so halacha l'maisa, the loaf of bread dissolves. But if you're throwing in stalks of grain, ultimately it's not just enough to throw it in, but rather one must scatter it as well. Fine. So we'll say, very interesting. What is the halacha l'maisa? Because obviously this is a major machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon about how you are supposed to properly dispose of chametz. So we'll say, so the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Taf Mem Hey writes as follows. This is Taf Mem Hey Siv Aleph. Keitzad bir chametz. How are you supposed to dispose of chametz? Sarfo o porero v'zora l'ruach o zarko liyam. So we'll say, this is incredible. So halacha l'maisa, how do you destroy chametz? Shulchan Aruch says, burn it, because obviously burning, right? The Mishnah Berurah points out over here, the goal, ideally you're supposed to burn. But if you're not going to burn it, porero v'zor l'rach, so you could go ahead and crumple it up, throw it into the wind, o zarkaliyam, or you could go ahead and throw it into the water. So I'll say, so now listen to this. See from here that way. So we'll say, so remember again, the Shulchan Aruch seems to indicate that halacha l'maisa, the din of crumbling is only a din when you're throwing it into the wind. But if you're disposing of the chametz by throwing it into the water, there is no obligation to crumble, because we assume that the chametz will simply dissolve in the water. And that is true, that's the psak of the Mechaber. But look what the Mechaber says. But if the chametz is very hard, and therefore the water is not going to dissolve it quickly, first, you should go ahead and crumble it, and only afterwards should you throw it in the water. Therefore, the way we paskin is, and let me just add in one more piece of the Rama. The Rama says, Hagal, Haminag l'sarfo, v'tov l'sarfo bayom, dumya dinosa shinisraf bayom. So we'll say, interestingly enough, halacha l'maisa, the Rama says, ideally, it is best to burn chametz. Now it's interesting. Then the Rama says, and when do you burn chametz? You burn chametz by day. Why do you burn chametz by day? Because chametz is like nosar. We'll say, what does that mean? Chametz is like nosar. So now we appreciate that statement. Because what did Rabbi Yehuda say? Rabbi Yehuda said that halacha l'maisa, just like nosar, is asar b'achila, asar b'ano, and ultimately again is burned. So to chametz, asar b'achila, asar b'ano. Therefore, the way to dispose of it is we burn. So both say. So interestingly enough, what happens over here is as follows: we paskin like the chachamim, which means you could dispose of your chametz however you want. You want to burn it, you want to flush it down the toilet, you want to throw it into a river. You could do whatever you want. But the Shulchan Aruch gives two caveats. Number one, if you're going to throw it into the wind, you must crumple it up and discard it first. That's Aleph. If you're going to throw it into the water, you could throw it in whole, provided that you know this is the type of chametz that will dissolve. But if there's a concern that the chametz will not dissolve, then the Shulchan Aruch paskins halacha l'maisa, you have to go ahead and crumble it up first before you throw it in. Ramah says, although you could dispose of chametz however you want, the ideal way to do it is through sreifa, and we do it by day, dumya denosar, like the shita of Rabbi Yehuda. So although we don't paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, it is interesting to see how Rabbi Yehuda's shita does make its appearance in halacha. Beautiful. Weiter says the Mishnah, chametz shel nachi shav alav Pesach. Supposed to listen to this. If you have chametz that belong to a non-Jew, chametz that belong to a Gentile, shav Pesach. Suppose essentially you have a Gentile's chametz after Pesach. What's that halacha? Mutter b'ana. It's mutter b'ana. Now both say that's not a chiddush, right? Obviously, again, there's no isurim of chametz which govern the chametz of a nachri, of a Gentile. The reason the Mishnah is quoting this is because the next line, V'shal Yisrael Asher B'ana. Both say a very important piece. This is the content of chametz sha'avar alav Pesach. Then if a Jew illegally owned chametz over the course of Pesach, that chametz is Asher B'ana after Pesach. after Pesach. So the Gemara says, because the pasuk says you shall not see sa'ar. So the Gemara is going to discuss how exactly we learn this out from this pasuk. But I will say, but lamaisa, a very important lesson. Chametz sha'avar leva Pesach. If a Jew illegally owned chametz over the course of Pesach, that chametz is aser bana for everyone, not just the owner. It's aser bana for everyone after Pesach. Says the Gemara, mani mas nisin. So we're going to go on a little bit of adventure over here. So the Gemara wants to know whose opinion does the Mishnah reflect. Lo Rabbi Yehuda, lo Rabbi Shimon, lo Rabbi Yosef Lili. So we'll say it doesn't reflect the views of Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Yosef Lili. So we're going to discuss each of these sheets in just a bit. So whose opinion does it reflect? Or we'll say really, who are these opinions? The Sanya, here we go. Chametz bein lifnei zmano bein la'achar zmano overlove bilav. So we'll say listen to this. Chametz, both before the zman iser, as well as after the Zman of Isser. Both before Chametz becomes prohibited and after Chametz becomes prohibited, ultimately, again, it is punishable through a lav, prohibition. Toch Zmano, but if we'll say, we'll see what that means, but bepashtos, what it means is as follows. If you consume Chametz between the 6th hour of the day and the beginning of Yom Tiv, that's a lav. If you consume Chametz that was owned by a Jew after Pesach, that's a lav. However, Toch Zmano, if you eat Chametz on Yom Tiv itself, chas v'shalom, over alav bilav ubekaris to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds that halacha l'maisa, if you eat chametz over Pesach, you're in violation because of alav and karis. So Rabbi say halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Yehuda's shita is chametz before Pesach. When we say before Pesach, we mean from the 6th hour till the start of Yom Tiv, lav. Chametz sha'avar alav Pesach, chametz owned illegally by a Jew, and now after Pesach, lav. Chametz on Pesach, lav and kares. Amud beis, Rabbi Shimon Omer chametz lifnei zmano la'achar zmano eino over lav below klum. This is wild. So also Rabbi Shimon holds that halacha l'maisa chametz before the time of prohibition, which bepashtos means what? That chametz before the zman of Israel, chametz before Yom Tiv starts, and chametz la'achar zmano after Yom Tiv is over, eino over below klum. You don't violate anything. Toch zmano, however, chametz on Yom Tiv itself, over alav bekaris. Ultimately, again, chametz on Pesach itself is punishable by karis. Ubalav, and with alav. Umisha sha'asr ba'achila asr ba'ana. So we'll say the Brisa then goes on. The Brisa says, and by the way, from the moment that chametz becomes asr ba'achila, it also becomes asr ba'ana. So ason l'tanakama. So we'll say that opinion we'll see is in line with the Tanakama. Again, we're going to dissect. This is still reading the Brisa. We're going to dissect this Brisa in a little bit. Rabbi Yossi Lili Omer Tamalatzmecha. Rabbi Yossi says, "What are you talking about?" Hey chametz aser ba'ana kol shiva. So we'll say this is pretty wild. Rabbi Yossi Lili says, "From where do you know that chametz is aser ba'ana all 7 days of Pesach? Where do you know that from? Uminayin la'ochel chametz mishei shos u'lamayla shu over below saseh. And from where do you know that if one eats chametz from the 6th hour and on Erev Pesach, right, meaning from the 6th hour till the start of Yom Tiv, how do you know ultimately again that a person is in violation of a lo saseh shene'emar? Because the pasuk says lo se'achel. I will say a little bit taking us back to our Rabbi Avo Chizkiah. Lo se'achel. Lo se'achel alav chametz. So we'll say, take a look at Rashi. Lo se'achel alav, it's the last of the wide lines on top. Mishas shchita, dahainu mishei shos, ulamayla, shechama not alav. So we'll say, listen to this. So Rabbi Yossi Haglili over here is darshing the pasuk as follows. The Torah says, Lo se'achel chametz. Right? Lo se'achel chametz. So we'll say, which means what? That halach, now, remember it says, you shall not eat chametz on it. Rabbi Yossi says, what's the on it? The on it is the Karban Pesach. From the moment that you are permitted to offer up the Karban Pesach, halacha l'maisa, you can't eat chametz any longer. That's Rabbi Yossi Lili Shita. The Gemara says, Lo se'achel alav chametz. Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Shimon says as follows. I'm sorry, let me take a step back. So the Gemara says, Shneimar lo se'achel alav chametz. Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Shimon says, look at Rashi, Lo se'achel alav mishash shchita dahainu mishei shos u'lamayla shechamanot laharif. So halacha l'maisa, when does the isser of chametz begin? Lo se'achel alav. From the moment you can begin to offer up the Karban Pesach, the isser chametz begins. Di Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rabbi Shimon. V'chi efshar lomar. Rabbi Shimon says, really? Does that make sense to you? V'halo kvar ne'amar lo se'achel alav chametz. Shivas yamim tocha alav matzos. The pasuk Rabbi links the isser of achilas chametz to the mitzvah of consuming matzah. So does that not tell you that what? That halacha lamaisa, that when there's a chiyuv to eat matzah, that's when there's an isser to eat chametz. And everyone knows the chiyuv to eat matzah only begins when? Only begins halacha lamaisa at night, the night of Pesach. So how can you say that the isser of achilas chametz begins even earlier? To which the Gemara says, V'chi efshel lo markein v'lo kvar ne'emar lo se'achal of chametz, shivas yomim tocha alav matzos. I imkain mat hamalomar lo se'achel alav. Shabbos say lo se'achel alav chametz. Shabbos say, okay, let's say I accept that. Let's say I accept the fact that the juxtaposition between the obligation to eat matzah and the prohibition to consume chametz is correct. And therefore that tells me that halacha l'maisa, you only have an obligation to refrain from chametz when you have an obligation to eat matzah, which means the isser chametz doesn't begin until the beginning of Yom Tov itself. What do I do with the pasuk that says lo se'achel alav chametz? What do I do with that pasuk? Because that pasuk is clearly saying what? Don't eat chametz on it. What's the on it? So bepashtas, isn't the on it Karban Pesach? And that's telling me that the Isra Achila of Karban Pesach begins, the Isra Achila of chametz begins at the time that you could offer up the Karban Pesach. Abba said, when can you begin to offer up the Karban Pesach? Already again midday. To which the Gemara says, Imkein matam lomer lo se'achal of chametz, b'shah sheyeshno kum echol matzah, yeshno b'bal tochal chametz. So I'll say what it tells me as follows, that I learned from this as follows. The Gemara says, when it says lo se'achal of chametz, you know what that teaches me? When there is an obligation to consume matzah, there is an obligation to refrain from chametz. And when there is not an obligation to go ahead and eat, when there is not an obligation to consume matzah, i.e. before the start of Yom Tiv, ultimately, again, there is no prohibition to go ahead and consume chametz. So we'll say we're going to pick apart these shitas in just a little bit, because obviously there seem to be certain inconsistencies with what it is that they're saying. So hold on. So the Gemara says as follows: My time with Rabbi Yehuda. So we'll say, what is Rabbi Yehuda's logic? Remember, we're going to both say Rabbi Yehuda holds that halacha l'maisa, that if you go ahead and you eat chametz from sheisha osulamayla, right? If you go ahead and you eat chametz, right? Rabbi Yehuda was saying that halacha l'maisa, right? Remember, this was the last shita on Amud Aleph. Rabbi Yehuda said that lifnei zmano, from 6 hours until the start of Yom Tiv, as well as after Yom Tiv itself, there's a lav, there's a prohibition to eat chametz. And on Pesach itself, toch zmano, the halacha is you're chayiv on a lav and of kares. So lav from 6 hours till the start of chametz, lav on chametz sha'avar lav Pesach, chametz illegally owned by a Jew after Pesach, and lav and kares ultimately again over Pesach itself. So says the Gemara. Let's now we're going to begin to kind of analyze and pick apart these shitos. So my time is Rabbi Yehuda. What's Rabbi Yehuda's logic? So the Gemara says Tlasa Kroi Ksivi, because Rabbi Yehuda says there are 3 psukim written in conjunction with chametz. Lo yachel chametz. The pasuk says you shall not eat chametz. Right. Also, it says v'chol machmetzes lo sochelu. Don't eat machmetzes. Again, we'll define that term, but for now, let's just say it means don't eat chametz. Lo sochal alav chametz, and don't eat chametz. So the Torah tells us don't eat chametz 3 times. Says Rabbi Yehuda, why 3 times? Chad lifnei zmano, v'chad la'achar zmano, v'chad latoch zmano. Rabbi Yehuda says it's to give me 3 lavim. One lav is for chametz. One prohibition is for chametz from the 6th hour to the start of Pesach. One lav is for Pesach itself. And one lav, ultimately, again, is for chametz illegally owned by a Jew after Pesach. So remember again, kares is explicitly said in the Torah. The Torah explicitly says that a person who eats chametz on Pesach is chayiv kares. The Rabbi Shimon. So this is the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda. So now again, we're fine-tuning the sheet. This Rabbi Yehuda holds there's a lav before Pesach, 6 hours to the start of Pesach, a lav and kares on Pesach, and a lav on chametz shavar lava Pesach. Where does he get that? Very simple drasha. The Torah states the prohibition to consume chametz 3 times. 3 times, 3 lavim, 3 time periods. Beautiful. For Rabbi Shimon, we'll say, what will Rabbi Shimon say about this? And we'll say, remember again, Rabbi Shimon holds that halacha l'maisa, chametz before Pesach, from the 6th hour till the start of Pesach, as well as chametz after Pesach. Rabbi Shimon says, below klum. Below klum. There's no liability for that chametz at all. He agrees that halacha l'maisa, Halacha l'maisa, once Pesach starts, so then there is a lav as well as kares for Rabbi Shimon. So we'll say, what does Rabbi Shimon do with the three mentionings, right? The three lavim of chametz. For Rabbi Shimon, chad l'soch smano. So we'll say, Rabbi Shimon says like this: one lav is to teach me that in addition to kares for chametz consumption on Pesach, there's also a lav. The chol machmetzes, the pasuk of chol machmetzes, Rabbi Osai comes to teach me something else. I need it for the following halacha. Ainli elishin is chametz me'elav. So Rabbi Osai, chametz could refer to something which kind of became leavened on its own. Machmas davar acher minayin. But say, how do I know that if something only became chametz as a result of it, we'll call it an external leavening agent. So for example, yeast. How do I know that something became chametz because yeast was introduced to it? So chametz only tells me something which becomes chametz on its own, meaning its own internal processes. How do I know that if something became chametz as a result of an external influence, an external ingredient, that is also asar on Pesach? Tamalomar kol machmetzes lo sochelu. Therefore, the pasuk says kol machmetzes. Rabbi say in Rabbi Shimon's world, kol machmetzes is introducing a dramatically new halacha, which is not only is naturally occurring chametz going to be asar, but even chimutz, even chametz that is created through some type of external ingredient or reality is going to be chametz as well. What about lo ye'achel chametz? What does Rabbi Shimon do with that third pasuk? Because remember again, according to Rabbi Shimon, there's only one real lav against chametz. It's only the lav if you consume chametz on Pesach itself. But chametz before Pesach is mutter. Chametz shavar lava Pesach is mutter. So now ultimately again, one Isser, one lo yochal chametz is to teach you the Isser on Pesach. Kol machmetzes is to teach you that halacha l'maisa, even if the item became chametz as a result ultimately of some external leavening agent, it's still going to be aser. What does he do with lo yachel chametz? It's very exciting. Rabbi Yosef Lili Omer. Listen to how beautiful this is. Minayin lePesach Mitzrayim. She'ein chimutzo nohig el yom echad. We'll see, we're going to get into this sugya, but there are a number of dramatic differences between the first Pesach observed in Mitzrayim, what we call Pesach Mitzrayim, and Pesach Doros, the Pesach observed in future generations. One of the interesting distinctions is that in Pesach Mitzrayim, the Isser Chametz, at least according to Rabbi Yosef Lili, right? At Pesach Mitzrayim, ultimately again, the Isser Chametz was only observed on that day, on one day. So the Gemara says, Talmud Lomar lo ye'achel chametz, because the pasuk says you shall not eat chametz, and what's juxtaposed that v'samich le hayom hazeh hayom atem yotzim, and it says today you're going out. So the fact that it says hayom today you're going out, and that's juxtaposed to the pasuk of lo ye'achel chametz, teaches me that by Pesach Doros, the first Pesach, the Isser Chametz only applied for one day, as opposed to, that's Pesach Mitzrayim. So it's the Pesach Doros, Pesach for future generations, the Isser Chametz is for 7 days. Rabbi Yehuda, so both say, now remember, where does Rabbi Yehuda learn out these halachas from? So remember again, Rabbi Shimon went ahead and learned out, he used kol machmetzes to teach me that even if something becomes chametz through an external leavening agent, it's going to be chametz. Where does Rabbi Yehuda learn out from? Rabbi Yehuda, machmas davar acher minale. Where does Rabbi Yehuda learn out that even if something becomes chametz as a result of an external leavening agent, that it is still going to be aser on Pesach? Mide'afki rachmana b'lashon machmetzes. So I'll say ultimately again, Rabbi Yehuda says, no. That's meaning we can learn two things. In other words, the fact that the Torah phrases an Isser Chametz in Lashon Machmetzes could teach you two things. It could teach you, number one, that there's a lav. Remember again, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you need 3 lavim. One for before Pesach, one for during Pesach, one for after Pesach. So Kol Machmetzes could teach me there's an Isser Chametz, but the fact that the Torah chose to write it in this way could also teach me an additional halacha. Namely, not only is naturally occurring Chametz going to be Aser, but halacha l'maisa, even chametz that becomes chametz as a result of an external leavening agent will be aser as well. So the Gemara says, "Midafki achmana b'lashon machmetzes." Rabbi Yosef Lili minole. Both say, where does Rabbi Yehuda know the din of Rabbi Yosef Lili? In other words, how does he know that like Rabbi Yosef Lili said that in Pesach, the first Pesach, the Isser Chametz only applied for one day? Where does he know that from? Ibay Sema. So we'll say one possibility is he agrees with the drush of Rabbi Yossi. The fact that Hayom Atem Yotzim is juxtaposed to one of the lavim tells you that the lav of chametz only applied for one day. There's no problem with Rabbi Yehuda agreeing with the drush of Rabbi Yossi. The other possibility is Smuch lo Darish. Both say maybe Rabbi Yehuda just doesn't agree with Rabbi Yossi. Maybe he just doesn't agree. Maybe he holds that even by Pesach Mitzrayim, the Isser Chametz was in fact there all 7 days. Maybe he just disagrees. So possibility one is he agrees with the drasha. Possibility two is he doesn't agree with the drasha. Now the Gemara says the reason he wouldn't agree with the drasha is because maybe he doesn't agree with the exegetical principle of darshin and smuchin. Maybe he doesn't agree with the fact that we darshin, that we extrapolate halachas from juxtaposed psukim. Okay, Amar Mar. So what's we go weiter? But continuing in quoting the Brisa, so he said, and how do we know that if someone eats chametz from 6 hours of the day, Erev Pesach, and on, that one is over on a lo sase, shene'emar lo se achal alav chametz divrei Rabbi Yehuda. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda, right? Shabbos Rabbi Yehuda holds that Allah Lamaisa, lo se achal alav chametz is one of the lav, and teaches me that there's a lav if you consume chametz from the 6th hour of Erev Pesach and on. Amar Rabbi Shimon, v'chi efshar lo markein. So Rabbi Shimon says Rabbi Yehuda, how can you say that? V'alo kvar ne'emar, lo sochal alav chametz, shivas yomim tochal alav matzos. The Torah links the prohibition to consume chametz with the obligation to consume matzah. Does that not tell you that the Isser chametz only begins when there's an obligation to consume matzah? But if there's not yet an obligation to consume matzah before Pesach, there's no Isser chametz. Rabbi Yehuda Shapir, Rabbi Yehuda is saying good. You are saying good. He's saying good. Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yehuda Amar Lecha. So we'll say Rabbi Shimon. I'm sorry. Rabbi Yehuda Shapir Ka'amar Le. Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Lecha. I'm sorry. Right? Rabbi Yehuda, Shapir Kam Rabbi Shimon. What we said before. The ultimate thing Rabbi Shimon responded to Rabbi Yehuda was a good answer. Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Lecha, Hahu Lekovo Chova, Afilu Bizman Hazehu Da'asa. So we'll say ultimately again, Rabbi Shimon will go ahead and respond back to Rabbi Yehuda. And he will say, Rabbi Yehuda will respond back to Rabbi Shimon that the pasuk that Rabbi Shimon quoted ultimately, again, is there to serve a different purpose. Namely, to establish the fact that halacha l'maisa there is a biblical obligation to eat matzah bizman hazeh, even though there is no longer a carbon pesach. Rabbi Shimon, lekova chova minale. We'll say, where does Rabbi Shimon know that halacha l'maisa matzah bizman hazeh, right? Matzah, even without a carbon pesach, is still going to be a biblical obligation. Nafkalei mi ba'erev tochlu. We'll say, since the pasuk says ba'erev tochlu matzos, you shall eat matzah at night. The fact that the Torah phrases a separate, independent obligation, because most remember again, on one hand the Torah says amatzos mrom yochluhu, which links carbon pesach together with mar and matzah. So I would say in the absence of carbon pesach, there's no matzah as well. So halacha l'maisa, how do I know that there's a contemporary biblical obligation to consume matzah even now? Mi ba'erev tochlu matzos. The fact that it says at night you should eat matzahs. For Rabbi Yehuda, what does Rabbi Yehuda do with that pasuk? For Rabbi Yehuda, mi boile letami v'shay b'derech choka. Supposed to be very interesting. Rabbi Yehuda requires that pasuk actually for something else. Rabbi Yehuda requires that pasuk for the individual who is tamei and therefore unable to go ahead and offer up the carbon pesach and derech choka. Someone who's too far away. Rabbi, look at Rashi just a moment. Letami v'shay b'derech choka. Shafa b'sheina osa Pesach chay b'achilas matzah. So remember again, there's a concept of Pesach Sheni. Pesach Sheni is the makeup Pesach. Who utilizes the Pesach Sheni? So the two paradigmatic examples that the Torah gives is someone who is tamei, ritually impure, or b'derech rechoka, or very far away. So you might have thought that therefore if someone is essentially exempted from carbon Pesach because of their circumstances, maybe they should be exempted from matzah as well. Kamashlan Rabbi Yehuda says, Ba'erev tochlu matzos teaches me that even someone who's going to avail themselves of Pesach Sheni, because circumstantially they are exempt, nevertheless still have to eat matzah the night of Pesach. The Gemara says, you would have thought, Hol Pesach lo yochal, matzah umarer nami lo yochal nechal, because you would have thought, once the individual is exempt from going ahead and having to bring the Korban Pesach because of his circumstances, therefore halacha l'maisa, he also shouldn't have to eat. He also shouldn't have to eat matzah and marer. Kamash malano. Kamash malano said that halacha l'maisa, even though he's exempt from Korban Pesach, he still has to go ahead and eat matzah and marer. Rabbi Shimon, Tamei shahaya b'derech rechoka lo itzdirich kra. So Rabbi Shimon says you don't need a pasuk for that. That's obvious. Obviously, I will say even if a person can't bring the carbon Pesach, and right, even if he's going to avail himself of Pesach Sheni, he still has an obligation to eat matzah and marer on the night of Pesach. And I don't need a pasuk from that. Why don't you need a pasuk? Because we will say that's no worse than who? He says delogara me arel, because a person who is tamei or b'derech rechoka, ritually impure, too far away from the Beis Hamikdash, is no worse than an uncircumcised individual. And I will say, what's the halacha by an uncircumcised individual? The Torah says, "V'chol ben nechar dichsiv, v'chol ora lo yochal bo, Bohu eino ochel. So we'll say, what does the Torah say? The Torah says, ultimately, again, any uncircumcised person should not eat it. What's the it? The it is Karban Pesach. Bohu eino ochel. Ultimately, again, it's only Karban Pesach that the Arel can't eat. Aval ochelhu b'matzah u'b'marar. But ultimately, again, he still has an obligation to eat matzah and maror. Rabbi Yehuda, ksiv b'hai u'ksiv b'hai. Rabbi Yehuda will still say that halacha l'maisa, the Torah goes out of its way to go ahead and write in each of these situations. Rashi says, "Ksiv b'hai aralu b'neichar ksiv tamei v'shay b'derech rachokah telecho matzos va'af agav dematz yolef minei hilchach itztri chekei shelakol v'chov." So also Rabbi Yehuda will say that sometimes, even if something could be learned out from a different source, the Torah still goes out of its way, ultimately again, to go ahead and write it in both locations. We'll discuss why that is, but let's say we'll stop over here for today. Again, we're going to continue in kind of building out the Braisa. But we'll say, remember again, just to keep focused, the whole reason we got into this is because we're trying to figure out the authorship of the Mishnah. And the authorship of the Mishnah said that chametz owned by a Gentile is permitted after Pesach. Chametz illegally owned by a Jew is going to be prohibited after Pesach. Why? Because the pasuk says lo yira l'chasor. So we're trying to figure out authorship of the Mishnah, and what we're going to see is, so we went through the shitos of Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Yossi Haglili, and we're going to see, based on what we've learned, we've spent Amud Beis developing their shitos. We're going to see, based on what we learned, the Gemara is going to suggest that the Mishnah can't reflect any of their opinions, but Amir Hashem, we'll see that Sunday morning. Abosai, wishing everyone a wonderful evening. By the time you're watching this, it's a good Tevach. So I wish you a good Shabbos, because I'm recording it on Erev Shabbos. But ultimately, again, I wish you a good Tevach and a beautiful beginning of the week as well. Yeshkach Rabosai. See everyone tomorrow morning. A good Tevach.